you can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4, you can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific, and how?
Well, I guess it was about time for another Lana stalker. This one's name is Byron, a mysterious kid who hangs out in the cemetery at night, has an old-fashioned way about him, and is really into old poetry. His tastes are very refined and sophisticated, so naturally he's wasting his writing talents on Lana, who is suddenly a poetry enthusiast, I guess just because she's a girl. Byron leaves her love letters at her parents' grave in an envelope with her initials on it. At least he's a really classy stalker. Man, this guy makes me look bad. I mean, I proposed on one knee at an ice skating rink in ice skates, but I never did anything this romantic for my wife when we were dating. I guess email has all but ruined the art of love letters. If only I had thought to leave her a nice letter on those cold nights when she used to fall asleep on tombstones. It turns out this guy is actually risking quite a bit just to leave all this love poetry to Lana because his dad shoots him with a tranquilizer gun when he finds out he sneaked out of the house. And he threatens that if Byron does it again, he'll put, quote, more than a tranquilizer in that gun. Wow, that's a trick. I didn't know they made guns that fired tranks and bullets. So the episode plays up the sad and twisted, macabre life Byron is forced to lead, with deer skeletons and no trespassing signs all over his parents' yard, not to mention the stereotypical angry guard dog. Byron is locked in the basement all the time, a basement which looks suspiciously like the Kent storm cellar. Reminds me a lot of that trap door that's in every bad guy's hideout in the Lone Ranger, no matter who they are or where it's supposed to be. I'm half expecting Kryptofreaks to start stealing stagecoaches. Although Byron's parents look like sick nutcases, which they still kinda are, really, we finally learn when Clark breaks in and literally throws Byron out of his house that he turns into a hunchback Buffy vampire with eyes like a Star Trek Betazoid when exposed to sunlight. He was part of some experimental drug trial run by Metron Labs, which was owned by Lionel Luthor. Who else? And that gave him this bizarre condition which gives him super strength, a giant forehead, and I guess compels him to do just whatever Byron really feels like doing, except a lot more violently. Wait, Metron Labs? That's gotta be a Superman reference, right? I don't know what that has to do with a cosmic passive observer of mankind who rides around in a chair that can transcend time and space, but okay. So Byron bashes Lana against a tombstone because she can't love him and goes after Lionel for doing this to him in the first place. By the end, Clark cleans up his own mess because all this is pretty much his fault. I'm thinking maybe when the guy you've only ever seen at night tells you not to check him out in the daylight and repeatedly says the phrase, "You don't know what you're doing," you probably don't know what you're doing and you ought to think things through. But Clark isn't thinking straight. After all, things aren't so great between him and Lana ever since he made out with some other girl in front of her at a bar he forced her to go to when he was on Red Kryptonite, and this guy is major competition because he knows how to write poetry. Clark stops Byron from crashing Lionel's helicopter and gets really lucky because the only three people there just happen to be his mother, a blind guy, and a monster who forgets everything that happened when in monster form once he's human again, so he doesn't need anybody to go conveniently unconscious. So Byron goes in the hospital, apologizes to everyone for stuff he's not responsible for, still seems to be getting on great with Lana, to the point where Clark feels the need to leave the room, and then we never see him again. Oh, and the umpteenth Luthor subplot that's barely related to the episode. Lionel is impressed with Martha's, quote, business acumen. I'll give the show this, I really have the opportunity to say the word acumen when she starts reading his newspaper to him on a park bench and he offers her a job as his personal secretary. Lex and Jonathan are both unhappy about this for different reasons. Jonathan obviously because he doesn't trust the Luthors and wants them out of his family's lives, and Lex because he likes the Kents and doesn't want Lionel poisoning their wholesome lives, but probably more so because he doesn't want Lionel investigating all the weird mysteries in Smallville that he's trying to solve. At the end, there's more awkward and obvious innuendo between Clark and Lana about Clark keeping secrets from or getting in the way of their being in a relationship, then credits. I like that Byron doesn't have a typical revenge motive against Lionel, even though he easily could, given the track record of Kryptofreaks with generic homicidal motivations. This kid doesn't have any malice toward his parents, really. He understands that they lock him up for his and everyone else's protection, and he makes the best of his situation. But he also breaks out at night. when he can't possibly turn into the monster. And who can blame him for that? Seems kind of weird that he spends all his time in a graveyard and suspiciously comes off like that's just there because it's a horror-themed episode, but whatever. Byron is kind of a lame character and another guest character who gets more of a story than our regulars, but at least he's sympathetic, I suppose, and not really the bad guy this week. Once again, the Lex subplot is the only thing that really makes an episode worthwhile. Early season 2, and I'm already sick and tired of saying that. Lionel's taunting that Lex will never really gain the Kents' acceptance is a great moment of friction between them. I love it when Lionel asks if Lex really believes the Kents will accept Lex into their family, and he responds with, "It would be a step up." This show has done a great job periodically of showing the intense contrast of these two families' values and how differently they operate, and it's great that now it's beginning to transform into an all-out rivalry, a literal battle between these families, with Martha's decision to work for Lionel as the catalyst. Lionel is using her because he wants to learn more about Clark, which isn't stated explicitly here, but it's pretty clear if you've watched the previous episode with his first meeting Clark. And Martha is kind of using Lionel in a way to feel more challenged in her life and to use her education, as she tells Jonathan. The Kents and the Luthors are so different that for most of the members of each family, each has something the other wishes was in his family. We saw last episode how there's a part of Clark that would like the expensive clothes and the fast sports cars that Lex has. Lex has told Clark on numerous occasions how lucky he is to have such nurturing parents. Martha, we'll learn as we go along, misses the city life she once had. And Lionel, though this will really intensify later, already seems to have a thing for Martha that's maybe more than just respect for her professional abilities. Jonathan is the one stubborn holdout who isn't enticed in any way by the Luthors, and again, we'll get more about why later on. But I do have to question Martha's sense a little here, as much as I like the two families interacting now on so many new fronts. We're going to learn soon that a lot of why Jonathan despises Lionel Luthor is because he was involved in Clark's adoption, and he blackmailed Jonathan into getting a friend to sell his business to Lionel under the threat that Lionel would tell the authorities that Clark's adoption was faked. Now, maybe I should be talking about this later, but this is the man that Martha wants to work for and doesn't understand why Jonathan would be so upset. That would be like if a rich guy who owed me a favor gave me a loan to get a new car when I couldn't get a loan from the bank or anywhere else, then months later sent thugs to my house with crowbars every week and beat the crap out of me until I finally paid the loan back with interest. Then 10 years after that, my wife wanted to go work for that guy as his secretary. Pretty sure I'd tell her she was out of her gourd, and it wouldn't matter when she said something like, "Of course I understand what kind of man he is," like Martha does here. It's good drama, but it's also a little out of character. I think Martha would have more respect for her husband than that. This show already has a track record for trying to act a lot more cerebral than it really is, with the notion that despite obvious formulas, easy story contrivances, and 2-minute wrap-ups involving convenient unconsciousness and bullet time, all it has to do is sprinkle a few literary messages on top and it automatically becomes the thinking person's entertainment. This episode is the worst to date of those episodes because it can't just include those allusions and references, none of which are even close to subtle, but it has to draw attention to every single one of them. So the kid stalking Lana is into poetry and his name is Byron. Okay, fine. Kinda obvious, but I can go with it. It's better than calling him Dark Nightwalker or Albert Hitchclock or Creepy McCreepykins. But is it really necessary to have Chloe say, "Oh, Byron," like the poet? This macabre atmosphere with all the 19th century writing implements and the old-fashioned stove and the fact that Byron doesn't seem to have a single book past the 1840s is all pretty forced already, but again, does his mother really have to give him Edgar Allan Poe? Byron thinks this is in poor taste, because it is. It's in incredibly poor taste, and tells her how stupidly ironic it is. He writes about people being buried alive, Byron says. I'm already thinking Poe this whole episode. I can't believe it feels the need, just for the idiots in the audience who don't get all these clever allusions, to make his mother an ignorant moron just to drive the point home. The allegory of Prometheus is actually a decent one, I'll give it that, where Lionel uses the story of Prometheus being tortured forever for trying to live as a mortal man to illustrate how futile he thinks it is for Lex to try to gain the Kents' favor. It's also the only thing that really links the A and B stories thematically, besides just the fact that Lionel is responsible for what happened to Byron, and it kind of falls apart on that level because Byron is at no point seen as a god or better than man, but more as an unfortunate lab experiment. It's a bit of a mixed metaphor. And speaking of ignorant morons, there's a lot of work in this episode going into dumbing Clark down as far as humanly possible, not to mention making him a tactless and tacticless airhead. You know how I've always said I don't see what he sees in Lana? The way he's acting here, they're made for each other. Everyone in this episode seems to have at least a passing familiarity with the most major of poets except for Clark. Lana knows poetry, Lex recites John Donne from memory, in a scene that, if they really stretched it, I suppose fans of the Lana-Lex marriage in Season 6 might see as some early evidence that he already had a thing for her and she's too gullible and lost in her own head to notice. I mean, really, who says to a 15-year-old girl, anyone who doesn't have an appreciation for poetry doesn't understand that it's all about seduction? This could all work okay if we were in a show about a bunch of college-educated adults who are a little hoity-toity and assume that they all have at least a foundational understanding of all important social topics. But Lana and Clark are in the 10th grade, and she's looking at him like a total dunce for not knowing that Shakespeare wrote a passage that Byron recites in front of them. They've probably taken most of the same classes, if not together, going to the same school and all. So if Clark doesn't know major Shakespeare quotes, he either hasn't learned them yet or wasn't paying attention in class. The way it comes off really is like Byron and Lana can't believe that in his free time, Clark hasn't studied up on Shakespeare. I know this episode is a decade old, but things haven't changed much. In 2002, there weren't a lot of 15-year-old boys sitting up in their rooms reading Shakespeare, or any other poetry for that matter, unless it was assigned for class. Call me unintellectual, I sure as heck was playing Donkey Kong Country between homework assignments before I was picking up poetry books. So I see this as all just kind of a cruel design to make Clark jealous and give him love triangle face. We just had an episode that established Clark and Lana being on much worse terms because of his refusal to share a secret with her, and now he's got to pay for it by watching her get interested in this other guy. Which isn't fair at all, given that the stories tend to side with Clark and his parents about how necessary it is to hide a secret from most people. Remember that Pete was tortured only a few scenes after he first found out Clark's secret for that very information. To add insult to injury, Clark has every reason to be unsure of a guy spying on Lana in a cemetery. Lana counters that argument with him when she brings up the telescope thing and says, "Tell me you've never watched someone from afar." Wow. Okay, so Lana's alright with being stalked now? Well, now that I think about it, of course she is. She was pretty flattered by the butterflies in a box that was sitting in a room from Bug Boy in the second episode. Surely that leading to your getting buried alive wouldn't change your feelings on random boys staring at you from a distance. Maybe somebody ought to lend her some Edgar Allan Poe. So, of course, Clark turns out to be right, and even though there's no real maliciousness behind this guy, Byron's more than he seems. But he does something at the end that illustrates such a complete lack of sensitivity that everything he does comes off as just jealousy and not genuine concern for Lana's well-being, when he gives Byron a book of limericks at the hospital and then tries to read sonnets at the end of the episode. Limericks? Yeah, let's totally insult the guy right after you beat his monster self to a pulp, this guy who obviously takes his poetry very seriously, by giving him limericks. So when Clark starts reading sonnets at the end, I could have seen that as his trying to broaden his horizons and look for the worth in something he had never really appreciated before, but after he gives Byron limericks, that just comes off as a desperate attempt at impressing Lana. He does admit to her that sonnets aren't really for him, but as dumb as this episode has made him out to be, it's probably just so over his head he knows he doesn't even have a prayer at pretending to recite or write it, and has already totally given up by the time Lana walks in on him. Who knows? The point is, ever since that one instance where Clark had a super brain toward the beginning of the series, the show has been giving him the intellectual shaft. The more things he says he's not interested in, the less I like him. He doesn't like to fly because that's supposed to be clever and ironic. He's not sure about journalism because that's supposed to be clever and ironic. He doesn't like poetry because that's a hobby Lana shares with this other guy and the script needs something to make him feel threatened. What the heck does Clark like? I've already griped about Clark having no real hobbies, and it's just getting worse. Clark also keeps rushing in headfirst before he has all the facts, and he almost gets people killed over it. First, he just assumes Byron is going to hurt Lana when he finally sees him in the cemetery, and he lunges at him, making Byron hit his head and black out. Smooth one, Clark. Give Lana's potential new boyfriend a concussion before you even start asking questions. That'll go over real well with her. And then he shoves Byron outside after several clues that the guy doesn't like to be in sunlight for some reason, not the least of which being that he keeps screaming at him not to do that. You know, like it might be dangerous or something. So when Byron turns into the monster, knocks out Lana and attacks Lionel and his mother, that's completely Clark's fault. He doesn't really take responsibility for it either. He just uses his brawn to stop Byron, and that's it. Don't get me wrong, I like to see Clark not whining about things being his fault for once, but this one actually was. He's being a complete loser, and I guess we're supposed to sympathize because he's in an impossible spot, not being able to tell Lana his secret, but blowing things when he was on Red Kryptonite. Okay, I can see him making mistakes, but not being responsible for your mom almost getting in a helicopter crash level mistakes. I'll cover my issues with Byron briefly now that I've written a tome on how stupid Clark is this episode. There's a lot of suspense built up for why Byron isn't allowed out of the basement, to the point of eventually being chained up down there. This is unusual for Smallville. I was genuinely intrigued to finally discover the real reason for all this, and the big reveal is kinda lame and kinda lazy. It certainly doesn't live up to the suspense. This monster doesn't really have a set of rules, besides being unleashed by sunlight. Why does he have Byron's memories, but Byron doesn't remember anything the monster did? It's just not real interesting and not real well thought out. And was locking Byron in the basement really necessary? I get that if he goes out in the light, he'll transform, and that's probably the logic behind not even letting him go upstairs. But can't his parents at least try to make his life a little nicer by, I don't know, going down there with him every so often? Maybe spending some time with him? Maybe his dad could pull a blast from the past and build a big underground home for all of them to live in and fill it with food to last for 20 years. And questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven: who the heck keeps pumping all that dry ice into Smallville Cemetery? Is there a local Keep Our Graveyard Looking Spooky fund? And now let's go to the scoreboard. We have one kind of Kryptofreak with Byron. I can't count it because we don't know if he was made with kryptonite or not. We just know that it was an experiment, but not that kryptonite was necessarily used. We have one Lana stalker. That's, of course, Byron. We have one instance of Clark's parents being kidnapped or attacked. That's when Byron throws Martha out of a helicopter. We have one character who's not himself. That's Byron when he changes into the daylight vampire. We have one instance of convenient amnesia. Once again, that's Byron, who doesn't remember what he does when he changes. We have one love triangle with Byron, Clark, and Lana. And we have one instance of Lana getting knocked unconscious, but I'm not going to count it as convenient unconsciousness because Clark doesn't do anything super in front of her or anything. Maybe convenient in the sense that she's not around when Clark fights Byron, but that's a stretch, so I'm not going to count it. You know, there are 3 recurring elements in Smallville that I, with rare exception, hate the most. Let's see if this episode managed to avoid them. First, characters not being responsible for their actions because they weren't themselves when they did things. Secondly, love triangles. Again, some stories can make love triangles really compelling. This show rarely, if ever, manages it, and it does them all the time. And lastly, convenient amnesia, so a character doesn't remember anything they did, and there are therefore, once again, no consequences, and often it's also so they won't remember seeing Clark use his powers, and therefore he won't have to deal with those consequences. So that's right, folks. 3 strikes. For an episode that somewhat competently manages to start a Family Feud, it really sucks at playing Family Feud. Oh well, I guess it wasn't really fair. I only polled myself. I'm giving Nocturne a 1 out of 4. Was there anything I missed in any category? Leave me a personal message on Geekvolution and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.